Hey, welcome back. Andy Masich is with us. Andy's the president, the CEO of the Senator John Heinz History Center, a commissioner of the PA Historical and Museum Commission. Andy, it is always a pleasure to have you with us in studio. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
Thank you.
Andy, you're one of our favorite guests, and it's it's not a holiday weekend, it's a post-holiday weekend, and it's so good to see you face to face.
Wait, isn't this a holiday? Isn't this National Donut Day?
It is National
wait,
Donut Day.
Is that a holiday for you?
Well, it's a holiday for... I have a theory about donuts.
Oh, I can't wait to hear. Were they invented in Pittsburgh?
I mean, no, well, I don't think they were invented in Pittsburgh. And everyone knows that Washington Irving was the first one to record the word donut in 1809. Everyone knows that. But what I want to know is the etymology of donut. I mean, the word origin. I mean, where did that come from?
Right.
Well, the dough part I get, D-O-U-G-H,
Sure.
dough.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's spelled just D-O today.
Right, yes.
But what about the nut? I mean, it doesn't look like a nut. It never looked like a nut.
Was there a nut inside the dough?
No, there wasn't. I think the word was donut. Donut, N-A-U-G-H-T, which means zero. So I think it was a dough zero.
Oh, come on. Are you? This is just your
I'm
own.
Not,
you're
I'm
figuring
not
this
screwing
out.
with you here.
That's impressive. I've never heard that before.
I would like etymologists
the linguistic
to call
angle.
in. Yeah, get some linguists in here and get them on donut, because I think that might be the origin. That's right, a dough zero.
That's
I
fascinating.
thought you were saying it was like a do not.
Yes.
Like if you want to fit in your pants, do not eat this.
No.
That's probably good advice, but I don't think
don't
it's good
think-
etymology.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
All
Once you have a one donut, you want more, and forget about
right.
the pants.
That's no problem. Andy, have you had a donut today?
I had two of them in your kitchen when
Oh,
they arrived.
we're so happy
They
we were
pressed
able to,
them on me.
Yes.
I
Yes.
couldn't
Yeah.
refuse.
No,
So
I
you're riding
understand.
a sugar high as well.
Courtesy of the Salvation Army.
Yeah.
So thank you
Very nice.
for the Salvation Army bringing this by for us. Okay, Andy, it is the Arts Festival kickoff weekend.
Yeah,
So I'm going to be down at the Point. Will you be as well?
I will be there along with thousands of other people. And the great thing about the Point is not only is it a great open space for a big party and all kinds of fun activities, but it's also the place where Pittsburgh began. At the confluence of the rivers, where the Monongahela and the Allegheny form the Ohio River, 250 years ago, young George Washington showed up. He was a young Virginian, 6 feet 2.5 inches tall, red-haired, deep auburn hair he had then.
George Washington had deep auburn.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
How lovely.
And he
never knew
arrives and says, geez. I don't know if he actually said geez, but the colonial equivalent of that. And he said, somebody ought to build a fort here, because anybody who builds a fort here controls the western waters.
The flow.
And it came to pass that there was a fort built there. George Washington came back with an army the next year. He was captured. It was awful. Fort necessity. That was 1754. He came back again with General Braddock. They got massacred on the Monongahela River, about across the river from where Kennywood is today, at the town of Braddock. But then he came back again in 1758 with General Forbes. And by that time, the French saw the writing on the wall, and they said, we've got to blow up Fort Duquesne, which they had built at the forks of the Ohio. And they blew up the powder magazine and bugged out up the river in their canoes. George Washington and General Forbes rode in, found the smoldering ruins of Fort Duquesne, and they looked at each other and said, well, what are we going to call this place now that we've got it from the French? And Washington said, I guess we could call it Duquesne. And Forbes, the Scotsman, said, that sounds way too French to me. So how about we'll name it for the Secretary of State, William Pitt, and we'll call it Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, kind of like Edinburgh.
Right.
Yes.
And so that's why Fort Pitt and Pittsburgh were invented in 1758 when George Washington and General Forbes captured the Point. Well, if you go there today, if you go there this weekend, you can go to the Fort Pitt Museum. You can watch our staff there fire a 6-pounder bronze cannon. You can see the troops dressed in uniform. There's a terrific museum there. And you can also see the oldest building in Pittsburgh. And that's the Block House.
Oh, sure.
That brick blockhouse that's operated by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Since Mary Shenley saved the property in 1894, these ladies and their descendants have been preserving that blockhouse as Pittsburgh's oldest building, 1764.
A tiny little building.
1764.
Yeah.
So what happened? Mary Shenley had that building saved. All around that, after the Fort Pitt was gone, was it all industry and sloth? And
By the 1890s, there were warehouses and railroad tracks. There must have been 20 parallel railroad tracks going to the point.
all converging.
All converging at that point of land. It was a mess of industry and slums and residences. And the railroad wanted to tear down that old brick blockhouse. But Mary Shenley stepped in, bought it.
Mary.
She would not sell that. They said, we'll give you $50,000 if you'll let us relocate it. And she said, no, that's where Pittsburgh began. We've got to save this thing.
And what year was that?
1894. And she turned it over to the Daughters of the American Revolution. These were women who were descended from Revolutionary War veterans, and they were determined not to let the railroad have that, and they have been preserving it ever since.
That's fascinating. And so that's the DNA of the city of Pittsburgh. I wonder, of all the cities in the country, in the United States, if anybody has anything like that.
You know, it's pretty remarkable when you can say, this is the spot.
Yes.
I think in Salt Lake City, Utah, where Brigham Young said, this is the spot, you know, they may know that spot. But when it comes to other American cities, there aren't many where you can say, you know, this is where it all began.
Here it is.
Right here.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It really is.
Okay, so when you look at those pictures of the point back in the 1890s, or when photography was first invented, like you said, it was slums. It was now it's absolutely gorgeous. The fountains there, the picnicking.
Well, you know, you've all heard of the Renaissance.
Yes.
In the 1950s, on the 200th anniversary of Pittsburgh, 1758, George Washington and Forbes started. 1958, the city of Pittsburgh said, you know what? We're going to be 2 centuries old, 200 years old. We're going to have a bicentennial. We can't let our place of origin at the point look like a slum. And so they cleared it off. They created a festival park right there. And by the 1960s, they had built the Fort Pitt Museum. They had constructed the fountain that we know today, that
Really,
geysers
the fountain was there
water.
in the 60s. Okay.
100 feet in the air. And it's become the beautiful Point State Park, the jewel in the crown of our park system here. But it really came about because of the bicentennial, the 1958 bicentennial, that really focused our attention on the origins of our community.
I love it.
Find us on Facebook, The Ride Home with John and Kathy. We're
streaming.
We're Facebook Live right now with Andy Masich from the Heinz History Center. The Ride Home with John and Kathy on Facebook.
Yeah.
All right, so Andy's waving.
We are live
right now. So the Point State Park now has undergone a recent renovation, another renovation, maybe 3 years ago?
Yeah, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, a state agency that oversees state parks, has been doing a great job restoring the park.
It looks wonderful.
Oh, it really does. And, world-class landscape engineers and designers in the 1950s designed this. But it had kind of deteriorated over the years. So in the last 5 years, there's been a tremendous amount of work restoring that beautiful park. There was some controversy a few years back when they filled in the moat. They had.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, remember they had actually excavated a moat around the star-shaped fort. In the 18th century, there was a military engineer by the name of Vauban. Vauban was a guy who designed the scientific forts that were basically squares, but then on the bastions, on the corners of the square, there were these bastions that stuck out. So there could be interleaving fields of fire crossfires. If you just have a square box, there's no way to really protect the curtain wall of the fort. So they put these bastions on the corner so guys with muskets could fire along the wall.
I never knew why those were out there.
Well, that's why those pointy bastions are there today, and their reconstructions. And in the 1950s and 60s, they actually dug the moats that were around those. But those were kind of a barrier if you're having a festival down there and the kids fall in a 12-foot ditch. You know,
it kind of can ruin an afternoon.
Yeah, it really can. You got to haul them up with ropes, and there's mud down there, and so.
So you just fill them in, make it a lot
They
easier.
filled them in, and I think there's some beautiful amenities there. There are restrooms now. And the Fort Pitt Museum is a real jewel. Inside that museum, if you haven't been there, it looks like one of Vauban's bastions, and there are lifelike figures recreating the people who settled here, men, women, children, Anglos and Indians. They're all created using a technique called life mask or life casting. So the director of the Fort Pitt Museum, Alan Gutchess, is an amazing artist, and he finds subjects. He's gone to Iroquois Indian people, put plaster on their faces, cast their faces and their hands, and recreated people who look just like the people who would have been here 250 years ago.
Fascinating.
And so you can see those recreations in the Fort Pitt Museum. You can see some of the original muskets and cannons, flags. The only "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the oldest one in existence.
There?
Is right there, 1775.
No kidding.
It's a red flag.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. It's the Westmoreland Independent Battery flag, and it's got that rattlesnake all coiled, ready to strike.
Right.
And it says, "Don't tread on me."
Great image.
And that's what the American colonists were saying to King George, "Don't tread on me. Don't even think about it, because you'll get bit."
Oh, I love it. Andy Masich with us, the president, the CEO of the Heinz History Center. Andy, go back for a second. So you talked about George Washington and repeated visits here over the decades. Essentially, I mean, you could trace the history of America and George Washington as the first president to there, because he came back 2, 3, 4 times and more.
His first time here, he was only 21 years old. I mean, he was just a kid, and he was on a mission to confront the French, and he crossed the Allegheny River. He went up to Fort Le Boeuf near Franklin, and on his way back, he nearly drowned in the Allegheny River at 40th Street. Remember, we have that bridge. It's called the George Washington Crossing Bridge at 40th Street. That's where he fell in the Allegheny River a few days after Christmas, 1753. He nearly drowned there. And it's
Wait, is that why it's called Washington Crossing?
That's exactly why it's called that. He spent a freezing night on a little island that was right there. His fingers were frozen. He couldn't get a fire started. It was,
He was
freezing
alone?
cold. He had one companion with him, a fellow named Christopher Gist, a frontiersman.
Yes.
But both of them were soaking wet.
They couldn't get a fire.
They couldn't get a fire going. And it was so cold that night that when the sun came up the next day, the river was frozen solid. Wow. And they could walk across the ice to get to the Rite Aid at 40th and Butler. That's about where they came out. Would that the Rite Aid were there and they could have a cappuccino or something. But no, there was an Indian village there, a Delaware Indian village called Shannapin's Town. And those Indian people gave them dry clothes and some horses, and that's how they got back to Williamsburg and told Governor Dinwiddie about the invasion of the French.
There's nobody like Andy Masich.
He knows his story.
President and CEO of the Heinz History Center.
We need to take a quick break, but stick around. Andy stays with us as we talk about Fort Pitt, the Three Rivers Arts Festival, and the current exhibition at the John Heinz History Center. Stay
Find
with
us on Facebook. We're live right now.
We've been talking about the American spirit with Andy Masich, the president, the CEO of the Heinz History Center. Andy, fascinating about George Washington and his frozen night on the island and coming across the frozen river. So the American spirit clearly was born here with George Washington and all that. But at the Heinz History Center, you've got an exhibition right now that is a different kind of American spirit.
It just so happens that at the History Center right now, we have a terrific exhibit called American Spirits. But it's not about patriotism and spirit. It's about booze. And it's about the 18th Amendment and Prohibition.
Sure.
And I mean, think about this for a minute. Before 1920, when Prohibition kicked in and people weren't allowed to drink alcohol, the average American drank 90 bottles of 80 proof alcohol a year. The average American was
That
90.
cannot be right. The average
90
American.
proof.
That's crazy.
I'm telling you, the whole country was snockered for the first 100 years or so.
Holy
and so
smokes.
finally, ladies like Carrie Nation and other temperance leaders.
They had enough.
They had enough. You know, only men went to bars and saloons. Women didn't go. And the women would have to stand outside the bar saying, "Henry, come out here. Your children need you."
Yes.
And these drunken guys would come out and the wives would take them home. And it was just a terrible problem in our society. So the women finally convinced some of the men that we really need to do something about the drunkenness and the abuse of alcohol in the country. So they got this constitutional amendment passed, the 18th Amendment. And that's a really hard thing to do. It took years to do it. Oh, yeah, to change the U.S. Constitution. But they did it. And for a time, for a decade, America went dry.
So it was 10 years?
Yeah, about 11 years, actually. So people found all kinds of ways to get around it.
That was the problem.
There were scofflaws, people who just didn't believe in temperance or in the law of the land. And so organized crime came into being to smuggle booze into cities. And there were rum runners and boats that eluded the police. Elliot Ness went into business. The FBI was created to combat the organized crime that came out of Prohibition. And even regular citizens said, I want to have my wine, or I'd like a beer after work. And so speakeasies sprang up. And a speakeasy is an illegal bar or saloon. And usually they were hidden away. And sometimes the police, cracked down on them, but more often than not, they got paid off and people went to these speakeasies. But it changed American culture because now men and women went to speakeasies together and they had entertainment. Jazz was all the rage. Women cut their hair, bobbed their hair imagine during World War I and before Victorian era, women never even cut their hair. They just piled it up on their head, and they wore dresses that covered their necks and covered their ankles. Well, after World War I, 1918, the war to end all wars ended, America cut loose. It was the roaring 20s. Women wore short skirts. I mean, they were really short. And low necks and their bobbed hair. Wild dances started. The Charleston and others. I mean, they were fast-paced, crazy, frenetic kinds of dances. And all this happened as a result of Prohibition, in a way, at these speakeasies. And then gangsters, flappers, speakeasies became sort of what we think of when we think of Prohibition. But there were lots of regular people, regular folks, who were trying to get by, and they would make moonshine or bathtub gin in their own homes for their own use.
Sure.
And you could buy a brick of grapes. Compressed dried grapes would be squashed into a brick. You can buy that. And you could buy it in the grocery store, but it said on the cardboard box, warning, whatever you do, don't add 2.5 gallons of water and put this in a cool, dark place for 3.5 weeks.
Because something terrible will happen.
Alcohol may result, So these things were flying off the shelves.
Funny.
And people found ways around it until finally the repeal of the Volstead Act and Prohibition in the early 1930s.
I see. So something intended to stop a very poor habit had the opposite effect. It
Well,
just
well, you know,
But not completely, because we drink much less, except at the Kenny Chesney concert, but we drink across the country much less now than before Prohibition.
The Chesney effect aside, there is, you're absolutely right, Kathy, that before Prohibition, the average American drank 90 bottles of 80 proof alcohol.
Crazy.
After Prohibition, 21 bottles was what the average.
That's a huge difference.
It's a huge difference, and that's what it is today.
really 21 bottles.
It actually stayed way lower than it was before Prohibition.
Very nice. Okay, so you go to the Heinz History Center. You can see all that.
Yeah.
Plus, you can learn how to dance the Charleston.
You can learn how to. You can see Kate Jackson, the world champion Charleston dancer.
Not the one from Charlie's Angels.
No, this one goes a mile a minute.
Really?
You can't keep up with her. We've got it on the Jumbotron next to in our speakeasy. When you come to our speakeasy, you have to knock on the door and know the knock, and a little window opens, and the guy will ask you, "Get it right or get out." And then you keep trying, and finally he'll say, "Okay, you're okay. Come on in. The mayor's waiting for you." And then you can see wonderful cars from that era, including a Ford Model 18, which is a flathead V8 Ford, beautiful car with running boards on it.
Yeah.
This was Clyde Barrow's favorite car.
Of Bonnie and Clyde.
Bonnie and Clyde.
Wow.
He loved this car so much because it was so fast, it could outrun anything the police had. He wrote Henry Ford a letter. "Dear Mr. Ford, this is the best getaway car ever. In fact, this is the only car I'm ever going to steal. Thank you, thank you, thank you." And Henry Ford got this letter, framed it, and put it on the wall of his office in Detroit.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fabulous. So a replica of that car, that will be there.
Well, it'll be an original car, but it's not Clyde's car.
I see. Not
We'll
the-
also
or
have
somebody else's car.
We have the very first Tommy gun, the Thompson submachine gun that the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police ever bought, and they bought it about 3 weeks after the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago. And the Pittsburgh police were worried, wow, if those gangsters come here, we got to be ready for them. So we've got that Tommy gun.
Outstanding. Andy Masich, the president, the CEO of the Heinz History Center. The exhibition is still down at the Heinz History Center until when, Andy?
June 10th. You've
Okay.
got to come quick.
Oh,
And
You got to hurry up. It's
on
next
Sunday,
weekend.
there's a History on Tap event. Check out our website for more on tickets.
Storyteller extraordinaire, Andy Masich, is with us. And he's the president and the CEO of the Heinz History Center. I mean, clearly, Andy, you just leak stories.
It's just,
You
there's
do.
so many stories. Okay, so because I knew you were coming, I brought you pictures of our family speakeasy,
Yeah.
which was in New Kensington.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that the term speakeasy began here in western Pennsylvania.
How so?
Well, a woman named Kate Hester had a speakeasy in McKeesport. And it was an illegal bar, essentially. And so there'd be guys drinking down in the basement. And when the cops came around, she'd say, "Speak easy, boys. It's the cops. Speak easy." Because she didn't want to be found out.
Oh, that's funny.
So that
That's
term,
where it came from.
Yeah.
From McKeesport.
It really did.
Speakeasy.
I'm not making this up.
Kate
No,
Hester.
That's
All
very
right.
nice.
Okay, so that's 1891.
Yeah, and your
My
great-grandmother was a Kate as well?
Yes, she was. I know. Perhaps
What, your
they were.
great-grandma had a speakeasy?
Maybe.
Yes, and her name was Kate.
Really?
Yes, yes. We were looking at little photos of it, and there could be some shady connection
Yeah.
between the
Outstanding.
two women.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Very nice. Okay, so Andy, that exhibit is currently at the Heinz History Center, but it ends effectively next week.
Yeah, June
Next Sunday.
10th is your last day to see American Spirits,
Okay.
the rise and fall of Prohibition. And it really is a fun exhibit. Lots of interactives. You can outrun rum runners. You can do the Charleston. You can get your mugshot taken with Al Capone and Meyer Lansky and Bugs Moran. And then you can have it immediately sent to your iPhone.
Oh, cool.
Just by putting it in.
See, that's the beauty of the History Center, that you're using old and new technology, and it's fun for everybody.
It is. It's we absolutely love it. In fact, Mike went. New Mike.
Even Mike went?
No, new Mike was there maybe 3 months ago.
I think so, yeah,
He took his little boy. Dr. J is one. And they had such
Wandered
a fun
around.
time.
Yeah.
Mike can't get
That's
on
good,
because he's
Mike, yeah.
busy doing technical things. By the way, speaking of technical things, we're live on Facebook right now.
Oh, there.
So find us there, The Ride
There's
Home with
Andy.
John and Kathy.
Okay. Okay, so as that heads out, that exhibition, I'm most interested in what's happening later on in the fall, early fall.
We're getting geared up for a really big exhibit. It's called Destination Moon, and it's the story of the Apollo 11 program.
Wow.
And just think about this. It was almost 50 years ago that Neil Armstrong set the first human foot on the moon and took that giant leap for mankind. That was July of 1969. So next year is going to be the 50th anniversary. And think about this for a minute, because Neil Armstrong did think about it. The Wright brothers flew for the first time in 1903. 1969, human beings went to the moon. Are we a great species or
we
what?
sure are.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, look at that trajectory.
And he brought with him, Neil Armstrong, in the right cargo pocket of his spacesuit, he had a piece of canvas from the wings of the Wright brothers' plane from Kitty Hawk and a piece of wooden propeller, and he rolled it up and put it in his pocket because when he stepped foot on the moon for the first time, he wanted to remind himself and humanity that the Wright brothers flew 66 years earlier at a time when people said, you know, it's impossible for human beings to fly. It's against nature. It's against physics. It can't happen.
Yeah.
And 66 years later, Neil Armstrong was walking on the moon.
Oh, that's an incredible story.
What and what presence of mind
Yeah.
on behalf of Neil Armstrong to think about that, to want to honor them, and to follow through like that.
Nice. So this exhibition that's coming in is part of the Smithsonian. Of course, the Heinz History Center is part of the Smithsonian as well.
That's right. And we're one of 4 museums in America that will get this exhibit. We're the only museum east of the Mississippi River.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, really.
Nice job, Andy.
The other museums will be in Seattle, Houston, and St. Louis. And so Pittsburgh is the easternmost venue. And this is the first time the Apollo 11 capsule itself has ever left the Smithsonian.
Wow.
It's been 50 years. And get this, there are all kinds of Pittsburgh connections. North American Rockwell, a Pittsburgh-based company, built that Apollo 11 capsule. Westinghouse made the special cameras that brought us those images of the astronauts walking on the moon. Alcoa made the aluminum for the lunar lander. Union Switch and Signal, a division of Wabtec or Wabco, Westinghouse Air Brake, made the switches, the firing relays for the Saturn V rocket and for the lunar lander, the LEM. Matter of fact, Buzz Aldrin tells a great story. He was the second guy to walk on the moon. That when he got back in the lunar lander after they picked up 47 pounds of moon rocks and were traipsing around in the moon dust for 4 hours, they got back in the capsule and he looked at his checklist on his arm, kind of like Ben Roethlisberger's quarterback list.
Here's my plays.
And this one said, don't forget to close the hatch. You know, so he said, oh yeah, God, close the hatch. And he spun around, and you know they were wearing those big square backpacks on their back. So he spins around in this cramped space. His backpacks breaks off all of the switches, the relay switches, like in your breaker box at home, and it broke them off. Well, these are the switches you needed to flip to fire the retro rockets to blast off the moon and get home.
What?
He said, what?
What have I done?
He said, how are we going to get out of here? And they called Mission Control, and these guys are all scratching their crew-cutted heads, and they're trying to MacGyver their way through this thing, but no one knows how they're going to do it. And it's Aldrin who figures it out. He takes his Duro pen that's Velcroed to his spacesuit. He unscrews it, takes the guts of the pen out, you know, the ink, and he mashes one of the pieces of the broken switch from Union Switch and Signal here in Wilmerding, and he mashes it in there, puts the pen back together, and at the appointed hour, he jams the pen into the hole where the switch used to be. It fires the retro rocket. They blast off the moon. They dock with the Columbia capsule, the Apollo 11 capsule, and they come back to Earth, the first men to return from the moon.
That's a great story.
And we're going to have that pen and the
pen's
broken
gonna be-
parts.
Oh, that's so
We're
cool.
even going to have the Wright brothers plane fragments that Neil Armstrong took to the moon. Yeah.
That is fabulous.
Really?
Stick with us,
Yeah,
Kathy.
you do.
I knew the pen, but I didn't know that.
So the exhibition is called what?
It's called Destination Moon, the Apollo 11 mission, and it's going to be here in Pittsburgh starting in September, and it'll go through February of 2019. So you've got to put this on your calendar.
For
It's
sure.
a once-in-a-lifetime
That is
opportunity.
tremendous. Okay, listen, our time's almost up, but I want to make sure to give you a chance to talk about History on Tap, which is coming up this Sunday.
Yeah, this Sunday, June 3rd, we have an event called History on Tap. It's $20 a person, $16 for History Center members. I hope you've got your membership card.
Nice, thank you.
And you're going to learn all about brewology. We've got a Smithsonian curator who specializes in the history of beer. You're going to be able to sample things. And it's Dr. Teresa McCullough, the Smithsonian's first ever historian of craft brewing and beer. She's going to be leading us through this.
Outstanding. Andy, it's always a pleasure. If
sure
people want more
is.
information, what about the presence on the web?
Well, you can go to www.heinzhistorycenter.org and find out everything. We've got videos, we've got audio, we've got calendars, so check it out.
Very nice.
And the next time you hear, we're talking about your book.
My book, Civil War in the Southwest Borderlands, not to be missed.
Excellent.
He's an author, too.
Andy Masich, the president, the CEO of the Heinz History Center, storyteller extraordinaire.